Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. I'm your host, Mike Allen. Some of the most major weather events in Connecticut history have a very unusual thing in common. They occurred in years that end in the number 8. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, and we'll talk about those too, but when it comes to the worst tornado, blizzard, hurricane, and ice storm, well, they were in 1878, 1888, 1898, and 1938. Here to talk about these storms and what they did to Connecticut and more is Jack Drake. Jack's a meteorologist who's based in Western Connecticut, but has studied the history of these storms, and just wait until you hear the stories he's got to tell. Jack's going to be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question: many say the first use of a telephone for an emergency call occurred right here in Connecticut. What was the event where it happened? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Everybody loves to talk about the weather, sometimes complain about it, and I'm no different. I do it all the time. Well, so does our guest today, Jack Drake. Of course, he's got an excuse. He's a meteorologist. He's supposed to talk about the weather. Jack's a native of Connecticut, loved the topic of weather growing up. He went to school to be trained in meteorology, and now he runs a very popular Facebook page where he shares his forecasts about the weather in Western Connecticut. An intriguing part of Connecticut's weather history is that the worst storms in the state occurred in years that ended in the number 8. It's kind of uncanny in that respect. This episode was recorded in October of 2024. This way, future listeners will be able to put them in the proper context when they hear this interview with Jack Drake. Jack, I want to start off talking about death, taxes, and weather. All things that we have to face whether we like it or not, and you've picked this career of weather, which is very interesting, and I want you to compare the kind of tools that you have available to you today as you're doing weather forecasts in Connecticut, and compare that to what they had back in the late 1800s. I mean, I know it's night and day, but can you try and quantify just how bad it was?
It's beyond night and day. It's not only the tools that I have, it's how fast the information flows. That's a huge difference. Even between now and 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, the smartphones, the ability for somebody to send me a picture of a tree that was knocked over by a thunderstorm, and I can get that back online and report that out really quick, or give the National Weather Service a heads up that somebody spotted a tornado. That's huge technology that we just didn't have even 20 or 30 years ago. If you go back before that, before computers, it took a long time for weather data to be brought to a meteorologist's attention, right? Maybe it was coming from ships or it was coming by telegraph, right? So it was a totally different world, and I can't even imagine how they did it back then. I think there was a huge contingent still, where people looked at the sky and they tried to say, hey, there was an easterly wind and the barometer's doing this, and this is what I think is going to happen. I try not to lose that today, but it is easy to do that when you rely on the weather model so heavily. Plain rain doesn't do much for me, but I am a big fan of storms. I think a lot of meteorologists are. When I went to school at WestConn, which is one of the only meteorology programs in the area, it's like a flame, and the moths all come around that like storms, that like big snowstorms. They like to experience the worst Mother Nature has to offer. And obviously it's a fine line, because I never want to see any human suffering, of course, but I do get innate excitement out of the big ones.
We're going to talk about, and this is just incredible when you put this together, that there were 5 of the largest storms that ever hit Connecticut. All happened in years that ended in the number 8. So you go back to 1878, an F4 tornado in Wallingford, the blizzard of 1888, which some say is still the worst snowstorm in recorded Connecticut history. Then we had the hurricane of 1938, the blizzard of 1978 when Governor Grasso closed the state, and more recently in 2018, the macro burst and the tornadoes that came through, particularly Western Connecticut. So these were all like 40, 50 years apart, except for the 1878 to 1888, which is 10 years apart. But, I mean, that's just remarkable. Now, of course, the big exception to that is the floods of 55, which was the story all unto itself. But you have studied two of these deeply, the blizzard of 1888 and the hurricane of 1938. And we're going to go back and talk about those. Let's tell people quickly, though, what happened in 1878. This was a rarity in that it was an F4 tornado, and not a lot of these hit the state. And this was, I guess, in Wallingford, you say. What do we know about that?
It is one of the most destructive tornadoes ever. It was part of a larger outbreak. So they call it the tornado outbreak of 1878, which is where you get more than one tornado in a day, right? Usually it's more than three to really classify it as an outbreak. So we had several tornadoes, one of them particularly violent that did hit Wallingford, resulted in 37 fatalities and 70 plus injuries. According to the reports, homes completely swept off the foundation. When you get into those higher level damage rankings, you're really talking about a significant impact on life and property where you could take shelter inside in most thunderstorms and be okay. But if that F4 is coming at you, you really, really got to be in a basement or an interior room. In 1878, not a lot of warning. Your phone wasn't going off to alert you that there was a tornado in the area. There probably weren't even tornado sirens. So people got caught off guard. And unfortunately, that's probably what led to a lot of the fatalities.
So now let's move forward 10 years to 1888, and this is called still, I think, the Great White Hurricane. It was March of 1888, and I think there was like 50 inches of snow, and this is not something that just hit a particular town. This just devastated the state of Connecticut. You have studied this storm. Tell us what you know about it.
The first thing I do when I bring this storm up, when I go to, say, a school visit or talk to kids in an elementary school, I say, can you picture 3 to 4 feet of snow happening in one storm? And all the kids are always, whoa, But that's what it was. They couldn't really measure it well because it blew around like crazy. The Great White Hurricane is the perfect description for it because it truly was hurricane force wind gusts throughout much of the state. And a lot of people focus on the snow totals with the storm, but there was also a significant amount of wind damage. There were fires that were started because telegraph lines came down. But really an incredible storm in terms of snowfall and in terms of wind. It started on what was a really warm day. They said the temperatures were up in the 50s, 60s, perhaps even 70 degrees, depending on the source that you read. So we're talking like significant warmth for March, right? People were saying they were out in short sleeve shirts. And then they came back, and that night, all of a sudden, things started to change. And the temperature fell really, really fast, caught a lot of people off guard. And the next morning, they had these big snowflakes that were falling, kind of like when the rain turns over to snow. And then that morning, they sent all the kids to school. They figured, hey, it was 70 degrees yesterday. It's not going to be a big storm. By noon, they were rushing to send businesses were closing, schools were closing. They were rushing to send people home. People ended up getting stranded out, trying to make it home during the storm. There's several stories of that. And again, 1888, right? Different technology. People were trying to walk to work. People were trying to walk. People walked everywhere. There are reports of people getting stuck in snow drifts, frozen. There were animals they found breathing holes because their animals were completely covered in snow. That's how deep the drifts were. Whole fields were basically bare of snow. There was no snow at all. And then areas where the drifts were 20 to 25 feet over the tops of trees to the second floor of buildings. And it's just an incredible event all around.
Now, I read somewhere 24 million cubic yards of snow, and to put that into perspective, that would be 1/4 the capacity of Mount Everest. If you could, pour the snow inside Mount Everest, you'd fill 1/4 of Mount Everest with the snow that fell in Connecticut during this storm. And you made a good point about people walking everywhere. There were no cars in 1888. So this was horses, this is, people in stagecoaches. And I mean, it's just a different world.
Yeah, totally different world. And I'll give you one more story or two more stories that I love about the storm. The first comes from New Milford, and you speak of the horses. Bank Street got completely snowed in and drifted in. All the snow drifted in that area to the point where the only way they made the street passable was they carved a snow tunnel that the horses could fit through. So think about that, right? It's an incredible image. And I don't think anything like that's really happened since. And then my other favorite story from 1888, I didn't actually believe this one at first, but I found it two separate primary sources, one in Reading and one in Monroe, which are both kind of interior towns in Western Connecticut, similar climates, right? They said the snow drifts were so deep in some of the ravines from the storm in March. Now, remember, it's a late season storm. The snow drifts were so deep that people were able to harvest ice, which is, again, something they did back in the day. They were able to harvest ice from the drifts through June and even early July. It had not melted yet. And again, think about that. That's just like, I can't even consider that, right? It's just an unprecedented event.
Wow. That is a great story. I just want to throw one more thing in, too, since we're both adding things here. I think this is great. Alexander Graham Bell got the patent for the phone in the United States. He was, by the way, not the inventor of the phone. It was invented in France and Italy, but he got the U.S. patent in 1876. And 12 years later, this blizzard happened. So people didn't even have phones. I mean, this was, they hadn't saturated by any stretch of the imagination. So you put all these conditions together. I just want people to come away with an understanding of what this was like. Unbelievable. Okay, let's move forward because we could spend all day talking about that one alone or any of these, frankly. But the hurricane of 1938. Now, this was such a storm that they named it too. They called it the Yankee Clipper, the Long Island Express, depending where you were. And I guess there was a full moon, which made the tides worse. But one of the stories I've read, and I'm not sure if you've heard this one or not, but originally they thought this hurricane was going to hit Florida. And this goes to your point about how people communicated. And it kind of went from weather station to weather station. And somebody sent a note from Florida to the Washington, D.C. station saying, yeah, look, it looks like a hurricane, but it turned away from us and it's heading your direction now. And so some junior meteorologist in D.C. put out a hurricane warning, and his supervisor said, no. Based on what we've seen of the history of this storm, we're turning it down to gale force winds. And so they put out a gale warning, not a hurricane warning. And then pick up the story. What happened from there?
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up. The young meteorologist's name was Charles Pierce. And this is one of my favorite stories in weather because it's so true even today, right? The technology is always advancing. And he was this young and up-and-coming meteorologist. He just gotten the job at the Weather Bureau, which is a big deal for any meteorologist. And he gets in there and he is using a new forecast methodology. So he's using a little bit of a different way than they did in the past, right? And he goes in the office and just like you said, he talks to his two senior staff members and they're like, no, kid, look, hurricanes don't hit New England. Hurricanes don't hit this far up the East Coast. We're going to issue a gale warning. That's what they decided to do. What they didn't know was the exact location of the storm was a lot closer than they thought. 100 or so miles to the east of the Outer Banks. A little close for comfort, and the North Carolina actually did get hit pretty hard in that area. And they also didn't know that it was moving so fast. This was an extremely fast moving system, up to 50 miles an hour, it's estimated. And when storms move that fast, there's a component of the wind on the right side of the storm that is enhanced because of that forward velocity. So if you think about it, like if you're blowing 100 miles an hour and you're moving 50 miles an hour, it's going to be 150 mile an hour wind. So that they didn't really quite grasp that, and then they didn't know it was going to track. It ended up making landfall in the afternoon, September 21st, 1938, I believe, really close to central Long Island, and then it came north into the Milford, New Haven area. It's really hard to get an exact landfall. We didn't have all the the barometers in the best places back then. And we didn't have satellite or anything like that, but that's kind of the estimated path. So everything east of the center. So we're talking about Eastern Connecticut, Rhode Island, massive storm surge. All that water was pushed right up the coast. Western Connecticut saw extremely heavy rain, flooding, and they still got gusts to 90 or 100 miles an hour. But Eastern Connecticut, Rhode Island, you saw gusts well over 120 miles an hour. There was officially a 186 mile an hour gust, is very famous, at an observatory in Massachusetts. It's just an incredible storm in terms of damage, storm surge, inland flooding, loss of life. Based on the data, it looks like we do get a storm of this magnitude every 100 to 150 years. It's now been close to 100 years, right? So it's not something we can forget about, and I think that's why it's so important we learn our history.
I couldn't agree more. And here's another story from that storm. So many of the cottages along the shoreline were destroyed because here it was September and it was an unusually warm summer, which probably gave it more fuel, the hurricane. And, people extended their stay at the shore. And one of those people was an actress who everybody's heard of named Katharine Hepburn. And her house was among many that got pulled out into the ocean, and she just narrowly escaped death herself. Now we go from 38 to 78, 1978, and I was a newsman in that year. And this was the storm that Ella Grasso closed the state of Connecticut. And I'm sure you know about all these niceties. I got the ability to be on the roads because I had to get to a radio station to report, emergency outages to people. I was driving the Merritt Parkway up to the radio station where I was working at the time, and I couldn't make it any further. I had to turn around and head back home. It was that bad. So I didn't even get to work, which was crazy. But the Merritt Parkway had drifts of, like 5 feet in some places, and I was trying to drive through them, and it was just impossible. But what do you think about 1978's winter storm?
One of the things about that storm was there's a widespread 2 feet of snow all the way Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts. I believe up to 40 inches in a few places in extreme northeastern Connecticut, kind of where Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Massachusetts all meet in that corner. One of the probably signature snow events of the 1900s. People throw 93 in there, but 93 wasn't necessarily the same caliber in Connecticut that it was other places, right? To me, for Connecticut snowstorms, probably the storm of the century. There were big ones in other years. In 96, right? A lot of people probably remember the 96 storm or series of storms. That winter was a record winter in terms of total snowfall, but 78 standalone was a signature nor'easter.
Yeah, and again, the reason we're focusing on these is they all happened in years that ended in 8. So, there are plenty in between. And let's do this last one in this row of ending in 8. 2018, this macro burst, and the term macro burst came onto the scene with this storm, at least for me personally. I had never heard about these. And maybe, I don't know if there's a simple way to explain the difference between a macro burst and a tornado, and I'm sure the people whose property was damaged know the difference, but I think most listeners would enjoy hearing that.
Yeah, so a tornado is just it's a rotating column of air, right? The base of the cloud connects to the ground, you get a tornado. A macroburst is what we call straight line winds or straight line wind damage, and it's more of a downdraft driven wind event. The thing with a macroburst that I will say, and there's also the term microburst too, that's I think more common. People will say, oh, we had a microburst. And microburst is usually just a localized area that there was a downdraft. A macroburst, kind of macro, is just a larger size version of a microburst. So the macroburst that hit New Fairfield and Brookfield and then went on to the east, there was a tornado that touched down in Southbury. So again, it gets a little confusing with the definitions, but a macroburst is an impressive event and it's a large event. This thing was 3 miles wide. So damaging wind swath, 60 to 80 miles an hour, up to 3 miles. There were pockets where it got close to 100, 110 miles an hour. So whenever you see wind speeds of that magnitude in Connecticut, especially in the summer months, I mean, really any time, but especially in the summer months when there's the foliage is at full peak, you're going to get a ton of tree damage. And that's what we saw. We saw tree damage, roof damage, parts of the area and the Kennewood Lake region where it was almost every single tree was snapped halfway up. That's a marker of a serious wind event. At the end of the day, and I always tell this to people, and sorry to rant on here, I'm like, I always tell people it doesn't matter if the wind's blowing 100 miles an hour in a circle or 100 miles an hour in a straight line, it does the same amount of damage, right? You still want to take shelter in the basement. It really doesn't matter if it's a macroburst or a tornado. If you hear the term macroburst in Connecticut, you should be almost more scared of that. Somebody's like, oh, there's a macroburst coming versus there's a tornado coming. A lot of Connecticut tornadoes are weak, EF0, EF1 type events. A macroburst, you're going to get widespread tree damage. But in any case, take your weather warning seriously. The phone will go off. That was a change that was made in 2018. Is the National Weather Service reviewed that storm in particular. There were a couple other ones too, but that one in particular, and they said, we need to be sending phone warnings out for thunderstorms that are not technically tornadoes, but are capable of tornado-like damage.
Oh, and yes, there was one other weather event that happened in a year ending in 8. In 1898, a decade after the Great Blizzard of 1888, the northwest section of Connecticut was obliterated by what's considered to be the worst ice storm in Connecticut history. It lasted for 3 days. The southern part of the state got only rain, but in Litchfield County it was all ice, virtually stranding everybody in their homes for nearly a week. That wraps wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And one last weather event that some will actually remember: an F4 tornado ravaged Windsor Locks in Suffield on October 3rd, 1979. It killed 3 people and injured another 500. That tornado hit with no warning. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Jack Drake, meteorologist who focuses on weather in Western Connecticut and has a huge following on his very popular Facebook page. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, many say that the first use of a telephone in this country for an emergency call occurred here in Connecticut. What was the event where it happened? Well, the answer is the horrific train crash in the Tariffville section of Simsbury back in 1878. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we're going to look at this awful event when a train bridge collapsed, sending 3 passenger cars into the icy Farmington River in the month of January. And we'll tell you how a phone played into the rescue activity. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe, and please stay healthy.